Mate, Topher, I can't even get a reply from Senator Gallagher in the Senate.
But they acknowledge that there will be environmental destruction.
No Indigenous person has had experience at managing a country with that many people.
Hello and welcome to the Aussie Wire News. Today I'm chatting with Senator Ralph Babet about the digital ID scheme and, well, you won't believe what he calls our Prime Minister. Then I chat with Kevin Yu from the Institute of Public Affairs to try and wrap my head around just how much land is needed to achieve net zero in Australia. Spoiler alert, it is more than the size of South Australia. And finally, I'll chat with Anthony Dillon to try and understand what's going on with the Welcome to Country and whether our government is ever going to stop virtue signalling and actually start doing something to help Indigenous Australians. All of that is coming up right now. But first, there is an old saying whose origin is uncertain but may date back to Machiavelli himself, and the saying is, never let a crisis go to waste. The idea is that in times of crisis, politicians and governments can get away with things that they wouldn't under normal circumstances. And for that reason, a crisis, whether that be a war or a pandemic or a natural disaster, is actually an opportunity for those willing to cynically exploit it. When it comes to Cyclone Jasper, cynical exploitation seems to be the name of the game. The flooding rains haven't even stopped falling, and in some places water levels haven't even stopped rising, and already the opportunists are falling all over themselves to take advantage of this crisis. For example, we're assured in this tweet by Scott Hamilton, who is an adjunct associate professor at Monash University, because of course he is, that this airport is what climate change looks like. He says more frequent and more powerful storms and flooding. Ha! Well, I look forward to the RMIT Fact Lab fact-checking good old Scotty from Monash Uni because, in fact, according to Carbon Brief, the observed 13% decline in global cyclones is because of climate change. Which is a really useful thing to have discovered because back in the dark ages of climate science, by which I mean about 10 years ago, they were absolutely certain that climate change was going to lead to more and worse cyclones. And, well, the lack of cyclones was starting to make the whole anthropogenic global warming thing look a bit silly. So it is incredibly convenient that Carbon Brief have now belatedly discovered that climate change will actually cause the exact opposite of what they originally said it would do. Huh. Phew! I'd hate to think that science wasn't settled. But in fact, the science is very much settled, and don't you dare think otherwise, because here we have the headline, Climate Change and Unusual Weather Patterns, Tropical Cyclone Jasper hits Australia. So, here we have Tropical Cyclone Jasper, which is, according to the media and various self-professed experts, simultaneously proof of unusual weather. Because, cyclones making landfall in Queensland in the wet season? Since when has that been a thing, am I right? And Cyclone Jasper is also conclusive proof of climate change, even though climate change has caused a 13% reduction in cyclones. You got all that? Good. Now, the truth is, of course, that the science is not settled, and climate change science is about as scientific as shamanism. But instead of blaming every little thing on spirits, they blame it on gases, specifically CO2. Climate change has become a religion, a belief system that doesn't need any evidence or anything annoying like, I don't know, getting a prediction right. Don't be silly. Our predictions don't have to come true. Just read your Bible. Read the IPCC's latest report and genuflect every time Al Gore walks by. And speaking of the big Al, he's recently taken a break from profiteering from carbon trading schemes and big government handouts to come out of the shadows and pour praise onto the head of the new Queensland Premier. This is the guy who's replacing Anastasia Palaszczuk and whose very first act was to triple down on the Queensland government's climate change action. And whilst Al Gore clearly believes that his endorsement is a good thing, those of us with, eyes and memories know that his hockey stick was a fraud, his documentary An Inconvenient Truth was found in court to have a plethora of errors that completely undermined his message, and whilst the Earth's temperature is rising thanks to us being in an interglacial period, it stubbornly refuses to rise anywhere near enough to be even within cooey of the IPCC models. And this is why the alarmists get, forgive me, so turned on by natural disasters like Hurricane Jasper. It's their opportunity to stand on a soapbox and turn a natural disaster, the kind that's been happening since well before the beginning of recorded history, into a political point-scoring opportunity, to scare the rest of us into compliance so that we allow them to do things that we would never let them get away with under normal circumstances. And that's why absolutely everything is a crisis now. And no matter what happens, it's caused by climate change. Because the crisis is the point. And more specifically, taking advantage of that crisis in order to ram through things like centralised government power, digital IDs, central bank digital currencies, social credit systems. That is the point. They need this crisis because they know without it we would never give them that kind of power. They're determined never to let a crisis go to waste. And we must be equally determined never to let these psychopaths get the power that they desire. Now, here's the news. Well, no doubt you've heard the news that the digital ID bill is now before Parliament. It's being rammed through despite an enormous amount of concern being expressed by everyone from privacy groups to other decent members of our Parliament, one of which joins me today, which is Senator Ralph Babet. Senator, thank you for making time. You've got an incredibly busy schedule. We've got a very narrow window. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Topher. Great to be on your show. Yes, a narrow window. I'm actually not in Melbourne right now. I'm somewhere in Australia. I'm not going to say where because of obviously security concerns, but I'm on the road right now, fighting the good fight, trying to defend our nation against tyranny.
Well, look, the government is saying this isn't tyranny. Have a look at the way they're promoting this new ID.
Constantly verifying your ID can be a hassle. Sharing your driver's license, proof of age card, passport, Medicare card, birth certificate and address details puts all that information at risk of falling into the wrong hands. But there's a solution that makes our lives a whole lot easier and our personal info a whole lot safer.
What problem could you possibly have with the idea that the government is going to take all of that information, centralise it into a single government-secured database and know everything about us?
Look, that is the problem right there, the centralisation. Centralisation in any sphere of human endeavour can always be a bad thing. If you centralise power in the hands of, let's say, a corporation, that corporation eventually ends up dominating the marketplace, and the person who suffers the most is the consumer because there is no choice, there is no competition. Very similar to this thing. If you centralize all your different forms of ID into one place, you give the government massive levels of power and control over your life. I think they have enough already. We don't need to give them any more. And the other problem as well is that just becomes a honeypot for hackers and things like this. All they need to do is go to one central place and they have your life. That's all they need to do. And we've seen with the Optus leaks and all the other government leaks which we've seen throughout the years that this can and it probably will happen. So I don't like the idea at all of government having a central repository of every single thing that makes you you. Yeah. Security issues aside, what happens when the government decides that you're no longer a good little boy or girl and they want to punish you? Well, it's going to make it a lot easier, isn't it?
Well, you're not a conspiracy theorist there, are you, Senator? You're starting to sound a little bit conspiratorial. I jumped onto the government's own website talking all about this, the digital ID legislation, of course, talking it up and talking how wonderful it's going to be. And I must say, I was deeply comforted by the bottom line here, the last of these points, assuring us that this scheme would be both voluntary and it would be inclusive. Does this give you any reassurance at all? Do you believe that this will be voluntary?
Well, I don't have to believe anything. I just have to keep reading the legislation. The legislation itself says that at any point, if they deem it to be appropriate, they can just flick their fingers and make it compulsory. So it's just absolute madness. Look, this is going to be about as compulsory as that thing that we all went through a couple of years ago where you couldn't leave your house, you couldn't go to the shops, you couldn't go to the local cafe to get a coffee and sit down unless you complied with the thing, right? I'm not going to say the thing because I don't want us to get cancelled on social media and have our accounts taken down, but you all know what that thing was. That wasn't compulsory either, unless you wanted to eat food, unless you wanted to pay your rent, unless you wanted to pay your mortgage. right? So this is what they are going to do. And it's not a conspiracy. It's right there in the legislation, in black and white at any time. If they deem it appropriate, they can make it mandatory if they want. It's absolute madness. And of course, this legislation on its own, it's bad enough. But you have to understand the plan that the elites, the global elites, the globalists have for humanity moving on from here. This is just one piece in a bigger puzzle. The next piece, ladies and gents, the next piece is the social credit system. After that, you've got the central bank digital currency. These are all connected.
Yeah.
These things that we're seeing right now are not coming on their own. They're coming as part of a package. I'm just going to break off on a quick little detour right now. What is the central bank digital currency? But you can think of it as similar to money that you already have in your net bank right now, with one key difference. It's based off blockchain technology. What does that mean? It means that the government will be able to see exactly where you've spent your money. Okay, we all know that. They'll then be able to see what you spent it on, what you spent it on. So let's say you go to Coles, right? Or any other store where you do your food shopping. You go to that store, you purchase red meat. Okay, you're going to buy some red meat. You want to have a barbecue. Ding, 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 ding. Sorry, your card's been declined. Why has my card been declined? Well, according to our, central database system here, we can see that you have breached you've gone over your carbon quota for this month. You've gone over. And because of our commitments to net zero by whatever date they decide on eventually, let's say 2050, because that's what they're aiming for now. Let's say because of our commitments to net zero by 2050, you're not allowed to have red meat because red meat emits too much carbon in its manufacture. You have to eat the bugs this month. You can't have red meat. This is the power of CBDC. Now, once again, some people are going to say that's a conspiracy theory. All you got to do is go to the Reserve Bank's own website. They've just done a trial of central bank digital currency. This is going to come. This is essentially a mathematical certainty at this point because not enough people are pushing back against garbage like this. Now, you tie the digital ID with central bank digital currency, and then over the top of that, you put a social credit system on that. Now, people will say, oh, that's another conspiracy theory, mate. They already have a social credit system right now in China, whereby if you do something that the government deems inappropriate, what are they going to do? They're going to punish you. How are they going to punish you? By making sure your digital ID and your money, etc., don't work in certain places. I'll give you an example. Perhaps you go to a protest that the government doesn't approve of. Perhaps you go there, you hold up your sign, we demand change, government. We want change. The government says, no, we don't like that. They turn off your bank card and you can't buy or sell. Conspiracy theory, it's already happened. It just happened in Canada not long ago.
I was about to make the same point. I've seen it with my own eyes when I was in Guangzhou in China. It happened in Canada during the lockdowns, of course, there, the trucker convoy. And I would argue that the vaccine passport system that we had here in Australia was just simply a very simple binary social credit score type of system. Now, I've reached out to the Minister, Katie Gallagher, and I want to read the email that I've sent to her because I'm yet to have a reply, and I'm hoping you might be able to get an answer from her. So here's my email to her. I said, number one, what safeguards are in place in the legislation to ensure that private service providers do not themselves make the digital ID mandatory in order to access their services? Two, what inclusiveness measures, remembering they said it was going to be voluntary and inclusive, what inclusiveness measures have been taken to protect access to services for those who choose not to participate in the digital ID scheme? And three, if no measures have been taken either to bar service providers from making the digital ID mandatory or to ensure that service providers are inclusive of those who choose not to participate in the digital ID, then what does the government mean when it states that the scheme will be voluntary and inclusive? You'll be shocked to learn, Senator, that I have yet to receive a reply to my email.
Mate, Topher, I can't even get a reply from Senator Gallagher in the Senate, on the floor of the Senate during question time. All these people do is flirt around the questions that we all ask, and they are experts in non-answering. Now, Mr. Albanese, Prime Minister Albanese, when he came to power, he said we're going to have a more transparent type of politics, a kinder, gentler politics. And what do? They've rushed through, I think it's about 127 new bills in the last year, 127 new bills with hardly time to even read through them, hardly any time to debate them properly and find out what issues these bills are going to cause in the future. They've come out and they've called now I'm no fan of Peter Dutton, I'll make that clear, but they've come out and called Mr. Peter Dutton a pedophile protector. These are the kinds of people that we're dealing with right now. Now, Peter Dutton, he's many things, but he's certainly not a pedophile protector. I mean, come on. But this is the people that is running the show right now. This Labor government. The Labor government are nothing but a bunch of middle management type hacks. That's what they are. They are people who have never achieved anything in their lives of value. They've never created wealth. The vast majority have never run a business. They've never figured out how to pay taxes, how to balance books, and it is showing. These bunch of hacks. They have destroyed this country. They come out on TV and act like they are holier than anyone else. But when you go to the shops, when you open your wallet, you know exactly what's going on. Australia is a laughing stock. We've got weak beta male Anthony Albanese running the show. He doesn't have the kahunas to do what needs to be done to protect this country, protect this nation, protect our culture. I'm sick of these people. I have had a gut full of them. I want them all to go into the bin at the next election. Get rid of these people. It's time for change.
Senator Ralph Babet, holding back as always, just keeping it under wraps. You never tell us what you really think. No, Senator, I couldn't agree more. I'm so grateful that yourself and a handful of other great people are in there fighting for us. Please keep up the good work. And if you do ever manage to get an answer from the minister, then please do let me know. And thank you in the meantime for coming on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Well, here at the Aussie Wire, we've been following the story of energy usage, energy supply, energy reliability very closely since our inception in May of this year. And that continues today with an astonishing report, frankly, that came out from the Institute of Public Affairs and their senior research fellow Kevin Yu, which found that if we were to actually achieve net zero by 2050, we would have to cover 1/3 of Australia's prime agricultural land in windmills and solar panels. It sounds absurd. It sounds ridiculous. Is it really true? Because if it is, surely this is the end of the argument. So I brought the man himself, Kevin Yu, Senior Research Fellow from the Institute of Public Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you for having me.
Now, it's an extraordinary thing. I'm just going to put this is the cover from, this is on the IPA's website right now. 1/3 of prime agricultural land would have to be sacrificed for the net zero pipe dream. That can't be true. Surely this is just clickbait.
Well, what we've done, the research that we've done, Topher, is we looked at the government's commitment to Australia becoming what's termed renewable energy superpower. So that's essentially what that means is transitioning away from our comparative advantage in energy production through hydrocarbon to producing energy by way of wind and solar farms. And what we've done is to calculate the amount of Australian land that will be required to generate energy needed for Australia to become a renewable energy superpower. So for energy domestic consumption as well as export. So that's what it means for us to become a zero superpower. So that's essentially buying into this race to the bottom to become a zero superpower. And the implication is massive. It's absolutely massive. 120 million hectares worth of land will have to be sacrificed, which will be the equivalent to 15% of Australia's land mass, 1/3 of agricultural land, which is equivalent to the area larger than the entire state of South Australia.
Sorry, 15% of the entire land mass would have to be then covered in solar panels or have wind farms sited on them. All right, a couple of questions here. The existing wind farms have been sited in places where they believe they're ideal. That's obviously why they've been put into those places. But there are a limited number of ideal sites for wind farms. Have you factored in the reduced efficiency, the reduced capacity factor that would occur if we began to proliferate wind farms into less ideal locations? Or are you actually potentially tipping the scales against yourself by allowing for the existing level of efficiency?
Well, the thing about it is, with renewable energy with renewable energy infrastructure, there are a number of factors that will need to be weighed in order to determine the most suitable location for the infrastructure. It's not the case that a project proponent would look at a piece of land and say, "Oh, there's no farmland there. No one's using it. We'll take that. We'll cover that in solar panels. There's no one using that bit of land. We'll cover that in solar panels." That's not how it works. The location of wind farms and solar farms is dictated by labor availabilities, the availability of access to infrastructure, to supplies, as well as a number of other things, including native title rules and regulations. And so all of those factors combined means that there is a direct competition between land used for agriculture and land used for wind and solar energy production.
Well, I can tell you, I see that with my own eyes where I live now, out in the Murray-Darling Basin. You don't have to drive very far before you find yourself looking at beautiful paddocks that used to have cows or used to have crops in them that are now covered in solar panels. We're certainly watching that unfold. Now, it gets actually worse. I read further and deeper into your report, and it's quite an extraordinary thing here. You're obviously forecasting, or you're taking into account the forecast increase in Australian energy consumption and that of our trading partners that we supply energy to, which is a good point. We are an energy exporter. And isn't there a bit of a lie at the heart of the renewables argument where they say that our percentage of renewable supply is increasing and therefore we're getting closer to net zero? But isn't it true that at the same time our outright usage of hydrocarbons is also actually increasing?
Absolutely, and that's a misrepresentation of the facts. The demand is there, and the truth of the matter is that wind and solar, because of the much lower efficiency of wind and solar, they can't replace. That's simply the fact. They can't replace traditional hydrocarbon fuel, and so there's a greater and greater reliance as a result of increased economic output, increased economic growth of our trading partners and in various parts of the world, and the increasing population in places like India and including Australia as a result of migration, that the demand is there and wind and solar simply can't catch up. And so what does that mean? We will need more and more hydrocarbon fuels in order to meet the demand.
It's an extraordinary thing. Now, I wanted to try and wrap my mind around the implications of this 15% of Australia's landmass. I mean, you said it there. The entire state of South Australia would have to be under either solar or wind. And then, of course, that doesn't, correct me if I'm wrong, but that doesn't include all of the other transmission infrastructure that would be required, the transformers that would be required, and not to mention the storage that would be required, because even with that amount of area, I mean, it's just extraordinary. So I wanted to wrap my head around it, and I jumped onto the Australian website here. This is the Australian Government Land Use and Management Survey that was done. This is from back in 2015-16. As best as I can tell, this is their latest one. It breaks down the entire country, 100% of the landmass, into these categories that you see on the screen there. The relevant categories that really caught my eye by way of comparison with this: urban intensive uses and rural residential. Now, between those two, we've covered the land on which every single Australian lives. Your house block in town and the house, the residential area within farms. Every single Australian's dwelling is covered in those two categories. And if you look at the very right-hand column, we're looking at a combined total of what's that, 0.62 of 1%. Not even 3/4 of 1%. And yet you're talking about 15%. Where are we going to get these resources from? This seems like it's not even feasible.
Well, the resources that we're going to need to import into Australia will predominantly come from China, and the effect is that it's going to push us closer and closer to our most threatening regional adversary, because most of the solar panels and wind turbines that we're going to need in order to fulfill this net zero pipe dream will necessarily have to be manufactured in China. And the other side of the coin is that it will rip us further and further apart from our traditional allies in the region, like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and India, because what we're doing with our net zero pathway is to jeopardize their energy security, jeopardize their regional security, as well as our own.
It's an extraordinary thing to think that there are people, grown adults out there, who with a straight face are saying that we're going to save the planet by having a foreign country that does not have nearly as strict environmental controls on their own resource extraction and processing, etc., dig up billions of tons of earth to then refine and extract raw materials to then ship a quarter of the way across the planet to get to Australia to cover 15% of our landmass in man-made infrastructure, and that's how we're going to save the planet? How does anyone in government, in policy, put this down in a document and take it serious? Do they know what they're saying?
Well, the fact of the matter is that parts of the advocacy groups that are advocating for this net zero pipe dream, they've been relatively transparent about it. Not a full transparency, but they acknowledge that there will be environmental destruction, that we will need to turn our lives upside down. Take a look at Net Zero Australia's mobilisation report, for example. Our children will need to be indoctrinated in this religious faith of net zero. Our farmers may need to be kicked off the farms. They acknowledge all of that. They acknowledge the monstrosity of it all. They acknowledge the environmental destruction, the fact that it's going to cost up to $9 trillion by 2060, $5 trillion by 2050. It's all out there in public, and they've been relatively transparent about what it would all cost.
It's extraordinary to think that even with all of that, there are people who still believe that this is feasible, much less desirable. Well, Kevin Yu, Senior Research Fellow from the Institute of Public Affairs, thank you so much for the report that you put out. Thank you so much for bringing yourself and bringing that information to us here on the Aussie Wire. This is quite an extraordinary thing. To actually see it so starkly is quite remarkable. And I can only hope that we start to see a bit of common sense creep into this debate sometime soon. Kevin Yu, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's with some discomfort that we're about to cover a topic that, you know what, I usually let this sort of thing pass me by, the sort of stuff that has some political commentators pointing fingers and laughing and making mountains out of molehills. I'm in two minds about this one. But there is something of substance here that's worth talking about. I'm talking about Chris Bowen's welcome to country, his modified global welcome to country at COP28. Yeah, okay, there's a beat up there, but there is also a story. And to help me dissect this is none other than Anthony Dillon. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Obviously, there was a very quick beat up and blow up when people saw this. I'll just play the clip very quickly.
Friends, I begin with an acknowledgement that at the heart of action on climate change must be profound respect for those who've cared for our respective lands for millennia, the Indigenous people across the world.
Now, this was said to an enormous international forum in the Middle East, where they don't do welcome to countries, by the way. Australia is one of very few parts of the world where that is even a thing. How does this strike you, that this is coming from one of our most senior representatives of Australia as a people in a forum like that?
Look, I'm not losing sleep over it, but it seemed a little bit misplaced. However, to his credit, he did say he did tie it in with climate change, so there's kind of a loose link there. And
sure,
I'd like to explore that issue if we have a chance.
Yeah, well, no, absolutely. I find it interesting here. This is the kind of thing that, let's say Sky News, I don't want to name names, but some networks will jump on and make a mountain out of a molehill. And this is the stuff that I'll normally let pass me by because, honestly, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big of a deal. But what did change my mind on this particular clip is it actually feels deeply disrespectful to the Indigenous people that are supposedly being honoured with the welcome to country. To just kind of grab it and repurpose it like that and shove it out there in that international context, for me, makes it more about the person giving the welcome to country, more about Chris Bowen being seen to sort of observe this almost religious observance than it really is about any genuine acknowledgement. How do you think Indigenous Australians more broadly, even the ones that do want a welcome to country, how are they going to respond to this?
Yeah, some will be like you just said, but I suspect there'll be others because he tied it to climate change.
The cause
Some
du
will jump on
jour.
that and say, some will say, oh yes, we're the experts on that.
Okay, so actually this is a valid point. What exactly can we learn from Indigenous peoples in helping us deal with climate change? Can you fill me in on that one?
Yeah, look, in this day and age in 2023, well, first of all, let's go back. Prior to colonisation, yes, the Indigenous people were caretakers of the land, and it was certainly a different story back then where in this country you may have had, I don't know, 500,000 to 1 million Indigenous people at any time. So the land was much easier to look after. But these days, when you've got in Australia 27 million people, no Indigenous person has had experience at managing a country with that many people. So I'm not trying to downplay what may have happened prior to colonisation, but I don't think those skills, unless we're ready to give up our air conditioners, and I tell you what, in Sydney today it's a hot day. I won't be giving up my fan. Unless we're prepared to give up all those sorts of things, and I don't think many are. I can't, and I'm happy to be convinced otherwise, but I can't really see what from the past these Indigenous caretakers of the land could do that would be helpful in a country with 27 million people.
No, I think maybe they have the answer to that, because as part of the COP28 outcomes, there was a commitment from many countries to triple the amount of nuclear energy. And perhaps Chris Bowen needs to go and ask our Indigenous communities about their expertise in running nuclear facilities. That might actually really help us with our energy mix.
Yeah, and look, I heard, I can't remember what it was, I saw something the other day, but apparently some Indigenous people had some understanding of the atom and all that sort of thing.
Oh, I see. That's, wow.
Yes. That'll probably be in Dark Emu Part 2.
Was that on a rock drawing somewhere? They found it right next to the person with the spear, and then there was the atom with the electrons. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, buzzing around, yeah.
Yeah, buzzing around. Now, look, I don't do any of this to be disrespectful towards Indigenous Australians. There are very real issues there. I mean, the gap is real in terms of outcomes, in terms of quality of life, in terms of what we're seeing in Indigenous communities, lifespans, health outcomes in so many different ways. It just feels to me like Chris Bowen and this particular stunt, if anything, is rubbing salt in that wound. This is not done for Indigenous Australians. This is done for Chris Bowen, so that he can stand on that global stage and say, look at me, I'm acknowledging all of the Indigenous peoples of the world. This is part of the problem, is it not? It's politics that's caused a lot of these bad outcomes. Yeah,
there's better things you can do to help Indigenous people rather than this ceremonial welcome to country. And timing and context is everything. I don't mind seeing a nice, short, sweet welcome to country, either by an Indigenous or a non-Indigenous person, or acknowledgement of country or welcome to country. But when it's done to score political points,
it concerns me that this does have the feeling of becoming a state religion. We tell ourselves that we live in a secular country where there is no government-mandated religion, but this is really beginning to feel to me as if, they're cancelling Australia Day, they're toning down Christmas and so forth. There's a lot of other things that are being toned down. But this particular thing, this one thing is being amped up. Is this tantamount to becoming a state religion?
Look, based on just following on from what you have said, maybe it's reached the peak because there has been more backlash or resistance to it. So I'm hoping it's not going to go any further. We can only hope. But it certainly had become religious, ceremonial, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it has.
And I don't think people would mind hearing it and seeing it if they could also see that there was some really great work being done to help the most disadvantaged Indigenous people. So we seem to be big on the welcome to country, but not as big on action to coalface.
Yeah, well, this has been a problem for a long time. This was one of the reasons why the no vote got up. If we can just go back a few months to the Voice, the no vote got up largely because Australians, including a significant proportion, arguably a minority, there's argument over the representation within Indigenous communities, but certainly a significant minority, even within Indigenous communities, voted no. And it seems a big part of that was just frustration of the sense of this is just another political thing. When are we going to see some real world action?
Yeah, exactly. There's no substitute for the hard action at the coalface, like I was talking about. I don't outright oppose symbolism, but so long as it's used alongside action, it cannot replace action, which is what we've had for far too long.
Yeah.
Banning Australia Day, that's just another symbolic thing. Not going to help this person.
Well, Anthony, I always enjoy talking to you, but I've got to be honest, this isn't a story that I particularly enjoy. It's just, it's such a symptom of so much of what's wrong with our political class. Symbolism on the global stage is something that they jump at. Real work on the coalface, of course, well, they're nowhere to be seen when that needs to be done. But I do appreciate you chiming in on this and helping me to wrap my head around it. And thank you for joining us here on the Aussie Wire News.
Thank you. Been a pleasure.
Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire News. We release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. You can catch up on past episodes at theaussiewire.com and be sure to check out our blog and join our email list while you're there. And finally, if you appreciate what we're doing here at the Aussie Wire, please consider becoming an insider. That's a financial supporter. Insiders get giveaways, discounts, exclusive content, and our insiders community, all for a modest monthly financial support, which helps the Aussie Wire to keep doing what we do best, which is bringing you news and commentary with a focus on truth, freedom, and hope. Thank you for watching. I'm Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire.